Hi everybody, welcome to our next video. This is the third of 4 practices for effective helpers. And so the first 2 practices that we talked about were caring for others and mastering problems. This one is about innovating. And I want to make a point clear to begin with. Innovation is not always necessary to help. You don't always have to innovate in some way to help people. Sometimes help just means meeting a need. It means showing up. I had a neighbor move into our neighborhood yesterday, and the need was unloading a truck. I didn't have to come up with some grand innovation in that moment. I just had to show up and help unload the truck, and I was late. So I got there just as they were finishing, which wasn't the best timing, but the point is, there were other people who showed up. That was what it was needed to meet the need. This is not always what it means to help, though, and frequently, in fact, helping requires something more. It means solving problems. And solving problems typically means applying new ideas. And this is where innovation comes into the effective helping practices. If you want to be an effective helper, you need to know how to apply new ideas to a problem. And this is how you create more sustainable improvements to the lives of the people you're trying to help. And so I want to talk about this idea next, because when we say a problem is hard to solve, what does that mean? Why is the problem hard to solve is the question that we need to answer before we can talk about why innovation works the way it does. If you remember last time, we talked about how rational behavior is often the thing that's helping a problem persist. In fact, it usually is the case that a problem persists because of rational behavior. And so like last time we talked about the tragedy of the commons, it makes sense for everybody to be on the road in heavy traffic. It makes sense rationally for them to be on the road, but then the problem is everybody does it, then it creates suboptimal circumstances for everyone. This is the product of rational behavior. And so when we talked about this last time in the video and then again in class, I just really want to emphasize this idea that most problems persist because anybody, given the circumstances and incentives for any individual that you have in mind who's struggling with a problem, pretty much anybody would make the same choices that person is probably making. That's an assumption you need to start with to really understand why problems exist. Well, what happens is when you have a problem that's persisting, it's usually persisting because of an equilibrium. An equilibrium occurs when you have a state in which there are forces or influences that create a balance between each other. And so this balance creates a stationary state, one that isn't going to change, because the rational behavior is making it persist. To change somebody's conditions to solve their problem, you have to create a new equilibrium, and that means creating a change to their conditions. And so I'll give you that just as an example to this. This is a photo from a place in Ghana called Agbogboshi. And Agbogboshi is one of the largest electronic waste locations in Africa, and not the largest in the world, but it's one of the larger ones in the world. Ghana imports about 210,000 tons 150,000 tons of used electronics per year. So these are electronics, the majority of which comes from Europe. Things like 85% of the electronics that go to Ghana come from Europe. These are used electronics, some of which, the majority of which is usable still, so it gets sort of reused, not recycled, but reused. And then the rest of it ends up going into this landfill called the Agbogboshi. What happens at the landfill is embedded in all these electronics are valuable resources like copper wiring, for example. And more specifically, the copper metal has value. And so there are people who live on and around Agbogboshi, and a lot of these people are called burners. And what they do is they collect wiring or other plastic encased metals like this, and they'll just burn off all the plastic coating on the wiring. And then they harvest the remaining metals, and they usually make around $2 to $4 per day, $4 on a good day. And this is the way they make their livelihood. You look at this situation and you think, man, this is horrible. These people are clearly suffering pretty terrible health conditions. Agbogboshi is a toxic environment, made more toxic by the burning. And so the people there are suffering mightily. There are kids who work in these conditions that you see in this picture here. And you just wonder, how could this be the thing that's what they should be doing? Like it feels like there could be so many other ways that they could be spending their time that might be more fruitful to them. But, if you look at the reporting on this, and this is a quote from an actual burner, the burners are there because this is their best option. This is the rational behavior for them, is to be there. Ibrahim, who's a burner, who was quoted in an article, had this to say: "I have no choice. If I get a better job, I will leave this place. But for now, I have to make do with the burning because it's all I have." And this is a common condition. And if you're not looking at Agbogbloshi and the burners in the e-waste site, you're looking in some other part of the world where people are in pretty desperate, unpleasant, or unhealthy circumstances. So it makes sense for the burners to be there. Given all of their options, this is rational behavior because they have a slate of pretty terrible options. And so you may be thinking, well, the problem then is upstream. We need to fix things upstream, like, for example, making better use of our electronics. Well, let's talk about that, because you're going to see a chain of rational behavior all along the way. We'll start here with a cell phone. You have a mobile phone that you recently got upgraded from. So you have this used phone. Now you're trying to decide what to do with it. And the reason you upgraded could be many reasons. It could be because your cell phone provider offered you a free trade-in. It could be because your phone broke and you had to replace it. Whatever the reason is, getting a new phone made sense within the context. So we don't fault you necessarily for getting a new phone. But something has to happen to your old phone. And so you give it over to someone who's an electronic e-waste recycler, basically. Well, what ends up happening is you pass that on to the e-waste recycler. It passes through typically one or two companies before it finally ends up in a place like Ghana. And when it ends up in Ghana, it goes not to the landfill, actually, if it's still functional, or it could be refurbished, so it could be functional. It usually goes to a used electronics shop. And there are a bunch of these around Ghana where you can go buy used electronics, and everything from stereos to televisions to cell phones. You can buy at these used electronics shop. And so your phone actually does go to a continued better use, because somebody who couldn't afford a brand new one is going to be able to buy and use this old one, and it's going to last them a number of years longer. And so this phone of yours is getting an extended life. And everything at this point makes sense, except for the fact that about 15% of the e-waste that's getting shipped over to Ghana is going straight to the landfill because it's not reusable, it's not refurbishable, and so it's just going straight to the landfill. But even if your phone is able to have a continued lifespan, that will eventually run out. And what ends up happening is it goes to the dump. And so, and again, it makes sense why it goes to the dump, because it's sort of gotten this second life, and maybe even a third life with a customer, but eventually it's just not usable anymore, either because it's broken or because nobody else wants to use it when the person is upgraded. And so what do you do with this old phone? You throw it away. And the recycling options that exist right now are not all that great. There aren't very many manufacturers that take this tail end of their supply chain seriously. And so a lot of this electronic waste is not recyclable in any way, either for design reasons or other technology reasons. So it's going to the garbage. But if you'll notice, every step along the way, we have rational behavior. You upgrading your cell phone makes sense. We wouldn't call it irrational. It going to be reused or refurbished makes sense. And then once it's used up its life with in the secondhand market, then it goes to the dump. And once it goes to the dump at Agbogbloshi, then it makes sense for the burners to do the things that they do to make a living. And this is the nature of a rational equilibrium. This is a bad state of affairs that results from everybody in the chain making decisions that we would say on their own are fine. But it's the way those accumulate and create this balanced state that persists. And this is a state that continues to persist. And if you look at the work being done at Agbogbloshi, there are people trying to upset it or change it, but it's still a stubborn problem. Because the only way to solve this problem is to create a new equilibrium, to somewhere along the chain create a change of circumstances that doesn't persist because of all these people making reasonable choices along the way. The way this kind of stuff, the way these sorts of systematic levels systematic changes take place is through something that Anton Howes, and you guys listened to the podcast interview I did with them. Anton Howes described this as the improving mentality. And this is not a technique or skill or special understanding. It's a frame of mind. It's where people, innovators, he calls them, see an opportunity or room for improvement where other people don't see it. And so anybody is capable of this improving mentality, which is one of the things I love that Dr. Howes finds out in reveals in his research, that in fact, a third of the inventors during the British Industrial Revolution had no science background in the area where they were innovating or inventing new things. But the idea is that this improving mentality can be applied to anybody, but it's not that everybody automatically has it. It's a mentality that you acquire that anything, after all, could be better. And when you apply that improving mentality to the problems around you, that's where new and better things happen. The other thing that's important to understand, though, about innovation as it's applied to solving these social problems and creating new equilibria is often we fail. And so we try a thing and it doesn't work out. And there's some cool research on failure by Dr. Amy Edmondson, who's at Harvard Business School. She just came out with a new book called The Right Kind of Wrong, which is about the silence of failing well. And she has this cool framework of 6 kinds of failure from worst to best. And it's important. And I'm showing this because I want to emphasize there are some kinds of failure that are bad, and there are other kinds of failure that are good. And it's important to understand why this failure is part of the process of innovation. And so the worst kind of failure is deviance or sabotage. This is where somebody's deliberately trying to ruin a thing. There's inattention, which is the next worst, which is you're just sloppy or lazy, and that's why something bad happened. Above that, you get to inability, and inability is better than these previous two. Inability means you put somebody in charge of a thing that really didn't have the skill needed to be in charge of the thing, or you attempted a thing that was well outside your ability. Task challenge is the next level up, and this is where the thing that's being done is hard for even an expert. And Dr. Edmondson, for example, gives the instance of like a gymnast trying to pull off a new move or routine or something like that, where it'd be hard for anybody to do it, not just this world-class gymnast. And then beyond task challenge, you have some failures happen simply because of uncertainty. A new thing is being tried and we just don't know what would happen. We don't have a reason to know, and uncertainty can lead to failure because the information is lacking. And then finally, the best kind of failure comes from experimentation. And this is a deliberate process of failure, right? Experimentation is where you're deliberately trying things to find what the boundaries are to figure out what the right solution is. And science and innovation, invention work through this kind of experimental failure. The important thing to emphasize is that the 3 better ones, right, because this list goes from worst to best, with best at the bottom, these bottom 3, the 3 better kinds of failure, come from trying new things. The previous 3 aren't the result of trying new things. Those are failures that come because of other problems that led to the failure. But in all 3 cases here, with task challenge, uncertainty, and experimentation, failure is a result of trying new things. And so you can see why these are better forms of failure, because they involve trying to improve circumstances. Now, most people, when they think about innovation, they think of invention. And I want to make clear, I'm distinguishing invention from innovation. Now, often people, and even Dr. Howes, will conflate the 2 terms and use them together. I don't think of them that way. I think of inventors differently from innovation. And I'm going to show more what I mean by that, because invention alone is not enough. Many inventions fail. And I think one of the best examples of this in the international development space is play pumps. Now, if you haven't heard of these, this was a really innovative design, a cool invention that basically said, hey, let's turn merry-go-rounds into water pumps. If you've ever seen a community where they have to pump water manually, it's pretty arduous. And the idea was, why don't we just put a merry-go-round into a community? And then as the kids play on the merry-go-round to have fun, it automatically pumps water into a water tower, like you see in the image there in the top right. And then people have access to water from the water tower. And so the idea was, this is a creative way to add value, to improve the impact of a pump by also creating opportunities for play for children. Well, these were really Like there's a reason I'm using these as a cautionary tale, because they were not an effective solution. First of all, they only worked in communities that had relatively high water tables. They only worked in communities that had high population density, because there had to be enough kids to be able to play with this and to play on the merry-go-round to pump enough water for the community. And they were expensive and also faced a lot of failures. So even though there's this really cool invention, right? And I think we could all argue this is an innovative invention. It wasn't sufficient to establish new equilibria, right? It didn't create a sustainable change to the problem and the conditions supporting the problem, because you couldn't get enough kids to play on it in some communities. You couldn't drill deep enough the water wasn't high enough for a merry-go-round to be able to pump it effectively in other communities. It ended up being a very small number of communities where this could actually work. Well, when these were first launched, they got all kinds of press, and they were a big deal because it just seemed like such a cool, innovative idea. One of the funders of it in the early days was a large family foundation in the United States called the Case Foundation. And Jean Case, who's the co-founder and CEO of the Case Foundation, ended up writing later about this failure. And she had this really cool insight about how mistakes are not usually tolerated in the do-good world. She said this, quote, "It sometimes feels like philanthropic efforts are held to a different standard than in private or public sectors. All too often, there is less tolerance for mistakes, which leads to many organizations to become risk adverse. And when mistakes are made, the tendency is to sweep them under the carpet, thus depriving the sector of important lessons learned. But in reality, the very nature of innovation requires that we try new things and take risks. Sometimes they will work, other times they won't. But in all cases, we should learn from our experiences and strive to do even better in the future." And I love this insight. I will also say, though, the Case Foundation and others definitely overinvested in play pumps, right? They got enamored with this solution. They fell in love with the solution, and the invention was not sufficient for creating new equilibria. And this is the problem. So inventions are not enough. It takes more than just a cool invention to solve these problems. And what happens is we get so enamored by the invention that we end up loving the solution, which turns out to not actually work, when instead we really need to love the problem, like we teach in the Ballard Center. Now, if you do want to undertake invention, because invention isn't enough, but it's necessary still, we need new and better ways to do things. You can use good tools to invent more effectively. So you can look at past innovations and learn from them. You can learn how to do a human-centered design thinking process, or rapid prototyping is a very common way to test and figure out if this stuff is sustainable and going to work. Regularly doing testing and getting feedback is an important process here. Also documenting your learning process, where you go from one iteration to the next. That documentation is part of how innovation works better. There's another tool called Scamper, which stands for substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to other use, eliminate, or rearrange. And that Scamper model is a way to sort of apply creative thinking to a problem. Another form of creative thinking is the ABCDs, which stands for always be collecting dots to always be connecting dots. And this is something I've stolen from a friend of mine who stole it from somebody else. But the idea is that creativity often comes from connecting otherwise unrelated things. And then mind mapping is another tool for understanding a problem more deeply, to be innovative about that problem. So if invention isn't enough, and I'm saying that invention and innovation are not the same thing, I want to give you a broader perspective on what innovation really involves, because an invention is necessary but not sufficient to creating new equilibria. And I want to talk about what actually does do that. So there are really 4 roles to innovation. Like there are 4 ways that you as a helper can be involved in growing and developing new solutions to problems. The first of these is being the inventor, which we've already talked about. These are people who create new solutions that didn't exist before. But you don't have to be an inventor to participate in innovation. You have other cool ideas there are other cool ways to be involved. One of them is to be an improver. And so this is somebody who takes the solution from an inventor and then figures out a way to make that solution more efficient, more affordable, or more effective. And you see improvers in pretty much every industry. So I doubt any of you can name the inventor of windshield wipers. I don't even remember who the inventor is of windshield wipers. But I also would point out that you're not using the same windshield wiper technology in your car today that existed 80 years ago. 80 years ago, the technology is much more rudimentary. It had been invented, but it still needed lots of improvement. And over the years, people gradually improve these. So they're sort of like mini inventors, right? But improvers are the people who see an invention or solution and then refine it further. Another role you can play in innovation is to be what's called an extender. And this is where you take inventions into new places where they wouldn't otherwise reach. You see a solution to a problem in one arena and you think, boy, that solution might work over here as well. And so extenders are the people who find ways to take an innovation, an invention, and help it reach new areas in a sustainable way. This takes creative problem solving as well. There are all kinds of inventions that exist today, but they haven't been extended to areas of the world that really need them. And so extenders are the people who are really good at doing this. And then finally, and I think this is one of the most important and most overlooked roles in innovation, is the role of the enabler. An enabler is the person who supports other innovators to have a greater chance of success. This is the person who provides funding, provides opportunities, provides other sorts of resources to make it so that all the other innovators on this list, inventors, improvers, and extenders, can do the work that they're doing. And enablers have a really important role in innovation. In fact, without them, innovation doesn't really exist. And I'm going to give you examples of this in a bit, but I just want to close with this point. Innovation changes the equilibrium behavior. That's what's so cool about innovation, is when somebody innovates around a problem, it creates new sets of rational decisions that create a new equilibrium where everybody is better off. And this is the fundamental nature of innovating around a problem. And so just to give you examples of this, if you want to do a little practice, what new idea changes the equilibrium? Like if your younger brother is getting bullied, how can you create a new equilibrium in this situation where everybody's rational decision making, even the bully, right? Who's like making life hard for your little brother. How do you create a new equilibrium in this situation where the rational decisions of everybody who's involved ends up being sustainably better? And then another example that's more systemic rather than individual is homeless people in the area are camping in front of local businesses, driving away customers. So the local business owners are mad. How do you solve this problem in a way that's sustainable and makes everybody better off? This is another opportunity for innovation to improve everybody's circumstances. Now, the sustainability of all this is going to be something we talk about next time. So the next topic we're going to cover is making help stick, figuring out a way to make help sustainable in the long term. So we're going to confront these ideas, but innovation is part of this process of creating new equilibria. And so what we're going to do when we meet in class next week is we're going to be talking about how we cured polio. And I'm going to give you examples of the 4 roles of innovators. We're going to talk about the inventors, the improvers, the extenders, and the enablers that really polio is basically cured. Now, there are 2 parts of the world where polio still exists, and this is in Pakistan, Afghanistan area, and then also in some remote parts of Africa. We're going to talk about that because it's a fascinating story and a great example of how innovation actually can create sustainable improvements in people's lives. And I'll see you all next time.